So thank you very much, everybody, for being here on this presentation. So this is a presentation. I changed the name. Why? It's how was Bill 8 passed in Quebec, an analysis of the response of unions, mainly FTQ, TUAC, which is the FWAC, and immigrant organizations like the Immigrant Worker Center and the temporary la Asociación de Trabajadores Temporaires de Quebec in the discussion of the bill. So just a background, this is part of, it's a very partial work, ongoing work that I started with a postdoc. That postdoc had four objectives: to analyze the discursivity on immigration and on immigration policies from unions, to describe the evolution of policies, practices, and organizing strategies of unions, to unionize immigrants also, but also to search to situate to understand the forms of participation of racialized immigrant workers in their integration strategies, and inside how this positioning is working inside the unions. Also, it shares to analyze the arguments, the political components and responses of and mobilization strategies of the immigrants organizations. So what I've been started to do is, it's a sort of long documentary review that I have to do. I started looking at some of the memories to the National Assembly in some specific moments of and discussion records. Um, for this specific work, I did a search on, journals, internet newsletters, etc. I still am not doing interviews with people from unions, but I have contacts. I did some questions, but not. So it's an emerging work. In terms of critical ethnography, I mean, I've been working with the IWC, and I know the position and the discussion, the internal discussions in the IWC since 2013 regarding the stance of unions and around the issues of immigration. So I have several interviews in the past. So the idea of this work is to have an initial structure of historical periods or blocks of data to analyze, like, for example, certain milestones in the 90s, in the end of the 90s, with the neoliberalization of the immigration, the impacts of NAFTA, or the Harper's measures with the safe the safe the lack of access for refugee claimants, the safe countries list, etc. There are certain milestones that will help me to order the information. But also I'm trying to identify key events for this study. Like, one of the key events that I think it's the approbation of the Bill 8. What is the Bill 8 in 2014? Well, first, it's necessary to say that in March 11th in 2013, the Quebec Superior Court decided that temporary agricultural workers have the right to unionize as any other worker in Quebec. So at that moment, we had like more than 4,000 seasonal agricultural workers in Quebec, mostly from Mexico and Guatemala. And then until that moment, the FTQ and the UFWC local 101 was working around those issues, already almost 10 years trying to unionize, and they opened two support centers for migrant workers in Saint-Remy and Saint-Eustache. They were closed in 2018. It was 7 years since the first request for accreditation, and at that moment, the UFWC represented 250 immigrant workers with 8 collective agreements at that moment. So also there's certain small history of previous collaboration between the UFWC with the IWC, the Immigrant Worker Center. But by the side of the Immigrant Worker Center, it started in 1999. It's a logic. They have a logic of popular education, leadership, formation, and mobilizing, like other worker centers in North America. In 2013, the IWC formed the ATTMQ, la Asociación de Trabajadores Temporaires, Étrangers Temporaires. I mean, an association to defend the rights of temporary works in Quebec, now changed to ATTMQ. And these associations started to work with casework, but also organizing some small groups in certain regions. So what happened with the Bill 8? As I said, I mean, there was this order of the court to approve, to change the labor code, allowing workers to unionize, but the PQ, le Parti Québécois, did not address this resolution. And then in 2014, the Liberal government that took the state, I mean, the government, they created this kind of bill to circumvent the unconstitutionality of the resolution of the court. Basically, the bill, what does the bill exclude? Agricultural workers on small firms with less than 3 permanent workers from unionization, from collective bargaining and strike action. And the only thing that the bill allowed is to form workers association to make demands on behalf of employees to the employer who is required to act accordingly in good faith. I mean, their obligation is just to listen to those demands. So there was a reaction, let's see, a reaction mostly from unions. But what I've been doing is to check the discussions. I mean, some of the discussion in the press, but mainly in the National Assembly. So by one side, in the discussions of the National Assembly, you had the Liberal government for sure, with the Minister of Work at that moment, allied parties like the deputies in the National Assembly, also la Unión de Producteurs Agricoles, so, I mean, la asociación como la asociación local of agricultural producers, also another two organizations related with them. This is like the part of the employers, and you had also implicated in this kind of net of integrated practices and discourses. I call this because also in this problem are, technical support agencies as firm. They are the agencies in charge of recruit workers, embassies and consulates from Mexico and Guatemala, and also recruitment agencies in the different countries. No? So by the other side, you had the FTQ with the local, with the UFWC local 501 and the two centers. And you had also the CSN in the discussions, and also advocacy. In this case, they were not in the discussions. The IWC was not present in the discussions. Another organization which at that moment was operated was Somos Hermanos in the region of Monterrey West of Montreal. So one mainly thing in this process is that agricultural workers were completely absent of the discussion. They didn't have anything to say. So that's the most curious thing of this process. But what happened in that? Well, when you analyze the narrative of the Bill 8, I mean, by the side of the government and employers, what were the main arguments? That small farms were very vulnerable, with low income, sensitive to market fluctuations, competition with Ontario and American, also with the USA, weather and there were specific times to harvesting, and they also were vulnerable to weather changes. Also, there was this kind of discursivity of the small farms as cultural and an economic heritage from Quebec. I mean, this was coming mainly from deputies from the region of Quebec. Also, unions and sorry, cannot see this. It's shared yet? Yes. Yeah, the idea that if there's going to be unions and strikes, that's going to put at risk the provision of food to the Quebec population. Also, there was already an institutional, they were saying that there was already an institutional labor fund to protect workers, embassies, immigration, FERM, the agency to recruit workers, the CNSST, which is the organization that define labor standards. Also, even they mentioned that the same employers protected workers because they act in good faith. So those associations, I mean, and also they said that associations proposed by Bill 8 for workers were enough for workers' demands and protections. I think that there was a similar law in Ontario and was used as an example that things were working at that time. So, and against that narrative, we have the defense of the FTQ and the TUAC. The TUAC in France is the FUWC, and also the CSM union. So what is important here is to check that the defense of the unions at that point in the discussion of the assembly were mostly around the principles of trade unionism. I mean, this principle that every worker has the right to unionize. But the main problem with this is that when you bring a principle, you lose, like, you take distance from reality, and it was difficult for unions to talk about real conditions of workers. Also, another argument was the unreasonable definition and classification of family farms, because as the employers defended, the family farms were small and they were in risk and vulnerable. They were saying that actually these small farms, they transform in the summer in really big farms, bringing a lot of workers. Also, they talk about the vulnerability of agricultural workers, especially seasonal workers, and they mention abuses of workers but without providing testimonies in terms of qualitative information and statistics also, right? Also, in terms of the participation of the IWC, they were not in this session, but what was the repertoire of action at that moment was that they had a direct experience with workers, and they were building a narrative against that bad apples narrative that usually circulates when you find a bad employer. There was an emerging narrative of racism and discrimination around temporary foreign worker programs and agricultural programs. But at the same time, they have a lot of lack of resources to develop a wider strategy beyond the individual defense of cases, and maybe some organizing process with some specific groups. So what we can see in this discussion and in the National Assembly is that the narrative of the government was easily imposed. They approved the law. Unions did not have enough data, I mean, quantity or quality or narrative articulated to data with research, coming from research, with academic allies, for example, or in another process, for example, that happened in 2018, there was data produced by the CSN and another union here in Quebec that when the National Assembly had to talk about temp agencies, they produce a very big survey with agency workers, but there was not that kind of work in this time. So what is more important, no workers, there were no workers speaking in front of the assembly, not only immigrant. I mean, there's a lot of other workers who are not only immigrant, they are immigrant living here in Quebec, permanent resident or temporary resident that are working also in the agricultural sector, but not even there, were there. It was also difficult for unions to counter. Sorry, we'll check the chat. Okay. So it was difficult to counter the arguments of the side of the employers or unions. And one of the main issues with this is that you can see that there was no any experience brought to the discussion in terms of organizing workers. The work of the centers was barely mentioned. There was not a narrative talking about the cases. And also what was important, when you don't have workers talking about the black box that are the farms, so the thing is that you don't have arguments to say, to counter the position of the employers. I mean, it's very important having workers, the voice of workers with a specific work situation, talking about that. So there was only an ideal frame that all workers should have the right of unionization. I can continue more, but maybe just to finish. This experience show us that there is a kind of, there are difficult cultural, ideological, and organizational difference between unions and immigrant organizations, like worker centers, for example. So they are important factors to define, I mean, to think, they are barriers to think how to overcome, to design oriented responses, and maybe to improve campaigns. It's necessary not just a collaboration, but a coalition or a previous alliance necessary. I mean, in this case, it was really necessary. And in the future, we'll see, I mean, in the future at that moment, but it was in 2018, there was a different, a completely different experience between the CSN and also the IWC regarding agencies that had good effects in terms of change of the law. So they included regulations. It was a small victory, and it's completely different way of how a relationship between unions and immigrant organizations developed. So that's one thing, but maybe we can discuss more because with some specific questions.